Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. It is getting to that time of year and the packing shed has now reverted into somewhat of a little Christmas grotto because there's not many flowers to play with at this time of year. To get our decorative floral fix, a lot of people start to make wreaths at this time of year, and that is what I'm going to do in this video. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I make a Christmas wreath. And I always start with my reusable copper ring. So this is a 12-inch copper ring here. And I bind using jute twine because I'm a softie and I find that easier on my hands than I do the wire. And then I have access to quite a lot of sphagnum moss here. So this is sphagnum moss here. And that's what I use as the base for my wreath. But if you haven't got a copper ring, then you can fashion a sort of circle-ish out of willow or just twigs by binding them all together. And if you haven't got sphagnum moss, you can use anything basically. You can even use old leaves, or you can use hay or straw. So whatever you can basically get your hands on. So I'm right-handed, so I work with the wreath on my right hand. First off, I'll loop the string around the little leg on the wreath so that it can't slide up and down. So just a double knot there around that part of the wreath. And then that's not going to slide up and down and annoy me when I'm binding. So I'll place that down on the table at 3 o'clock under my dominant arm, which is my right arm, which is going to be binding. The reason that's important is because then I'm not binding over my body, because you'll get a bad shoulder. The great thing about working with moss is that if you've ever done felt making, it's a bit like felt fibres, wool fibres. It naturally weaves together, which is handy for this process. So to measure how much I put on my wreath, I use a double hand's width, and then I place that on my wreath. And then if you've ever made what they called pom-poms before, it's just like making a pom-pom. So you just wind in and around your wreath like that. It doesn't have to be exact. It's probably about 3 centimetres between each piece of string. It's just enough to hold it on. And then another 2 hands width, and we just keep binding all the way around. And then when you get back to where you started, just overbind that first string so you know you've definitely gone right the way around. And then with that tail end there, all I do is go back round that wire ring to create a loop and then tie a knot through. And that little bit of string just gets tucked back into the base there. Now we're going to move on to the foliage aspect of it. So you can use absolutely any foliage for your wreath, depending on what you've got. You can even use dried stems if you'd like, but then I would say to use a dry base, like a straw base, if you were going to use dried flowers and seed heads and foliage and things like that. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be making a fresh green wreath. So my base materials are going to be this, which is Nordman fir. So this is just an offcut of the bottom of your Christmas tree. I use Nordman fir because it's the non-needle drop, because what we don't want is a naked wreath in a couple of days when all the needles drop out, and that will happen if you use spruce. So this is Nordman fir, so it's green on the front and silver on the back. And this is my other base material generally, which is noble fir. So I use a mix of those two firs. And rather handily for me, in the woods here, when I was walking the other day, a pine tree had come down. So I've got some absolutely gorgeous pine as well to mix in. And then I've got a hold of some of this lovely thuya here, which is variegated. And I like using thuya on the outside of the wreath because it's got a lot more of a feathery texture. So it brings a softness to the outside of the wreath. I love using foliage. I like to pack in as many different varieties as I possibly can. So alongside the conifer foliage, there's some absolutely gorgeous ivy berries in the hedgerow at the minute. So they're going to get mixed in. And it's a bit prickly, but I do like using it in a classic wreath. And there's loads of berries on it this year because it's been such a good year for fruit and berries. I'm going to use some green holly. And then I'm going to mix all that in with some of our eucalyptus and some little spriggets of Unanimous. So there should be absolutely loads and loads of different greens and textures in this wreath, which is what I want. Now, another thing I want with this wreath is I want it to have a nice swirl to the outside. So a lot of this comes down to how you place your stems in the wreath. So obviously, this is too big. I'll show you how we cut them down and what size I use in a minute. But it's easier for me to show you with a larger sprig. So what I don't do when I come to place in the foliage is I don't place it like that, because that's straight up and straight down. What I actually do is place it more on an angle like that. So to prep up some of this foliage, obviously that piece there is too large. So what I'm going to be doing is cutting it down to a hand size length. So I'm going to cut this piece of foliage there. Then we can also take some of these smaller pieces as well. Now, so that's all that's left of that piece. I'm going to strip down this big branch here into smaller, more manageable size pieces. So something around that size. So I'm going to strip lots of this fir foliage and the thuya and pine down now into smaller size, manageable pieces. If you're making a wreath, any pieces that you get like that, or you end up with very, very small pieces like that, don't discard them, keep them to one side, because in next week's video, I'm going to make a garland and some table centres, and these will come in handy. So just leave these pieces in a bag or a crate outside, and we'll use them next week. The pine's also cut down into hand-sized pieces. Now all the foliage is prepped. I've got all my base foliage, which is my fir and my pine on this side. And then I've got my thuya and my ivy and holly and eucalyptus and Unanimous on this side, because the likelihood is I'll end up using less of that. And I just find it an easier way of working to separate out the two different foliages. So now we've got to tie back on our string. So what I've done there is I've just tied that back around the copper ring. So I've not gone right round the wreath itself, just around that copper ring, and a double knot again. So now to start off with, what you want to do is pick yourself your favourite bits, because it's always good to start with an easy piece, and mix in some of the other foliages that you're wanting to use. So I'm going to back that piece there with some thuya, and I'm leaving that slightly longer because I want that to come out the side. And then in front of that, I've also put some ivy and some ivy berries. And now I'm going to start to build my wreath. So I'll change the camera angle so you can see exactly how I put my pieces into the wreath. We've got our string tied on there under my right arm, and that's where I'm going to start to place my foliage. So that's the sprig I just showed you on camera there. And what I've done is I've just removed a few of the needles and leaves to the base there, just to make it easier to bed the tips into the moss. And then this first piece goes in on an angle so it faces slightly out of the wreath, but it's not facing that way. So if you see the difference, that would be it facing directly out. What I've done is I've got it on a slight angle there. And then when it comes to binding, make sure you just bind at the bottom and don't take your string right over that top bit there, because you'll end up with a really flat wreath. So we're just going to bind across that bottom piece there and just pull the string. This is why I use string and not twine, so when I'm pulling it doesn't hurt my fingers. By comparison of size, you'll see that's a slightly smaller sprig than the first piece that I used. That's because that's going on the inside edge, because what we don't want when your wreath goes on the door is to end up with a bare middle section, because you will notice it. So this then gets placed on this inner edge and covers the inner of the wreath there. And again, you just bind it on. In this piece here, I've started to incorporate some of these holly berries and the eucalyptus so that I've got all my colours consistently going round the wreath. When it comes to placement, we place this by covering the bottom of the previous piece. You don't place under, you always place your next piece on top, and that covers that area there. And then just bind it on. And now we're on the inner edge again. So a little cluster there of the noble, the ivy and the pine. So it doesn't have to be the same cluster all the time. So this is the wreath so far. You can see how much it grows away from the side there. That's how big the wreath's getting. So that was my starting point, and that's where I currently am working. So you can see there all the different mixed foliages we've got going on there, and the berries. At this point you can start to think it looks a bit weird, but that's just because it's a little bit of an illusion. You've got a big full section there that you've been working on and a little skinny section here, and the juxtaposition can make your eye think, oh, I'm not doing something right, but just keep going, it'll be fine. Now you can see I've reached back where I started now. So what we need to do is put the final few pieces of foliage in. And to allow us to do that, we need to lift up the first few pieces that we put in so we don't accidentally rebind those pieces back into the wreath. So I've got a large gather of foliage there, and then I'm going to lift these pieces up and place it underneath on the outer edge. And then keeping them well out the way, bind it back in. And I need one more piece in here to finish off the wreath. And that's just going to get nestled into here. Don't worry if this takes you a little bit longer. Tying off is probably the trickiest part of making your wreath. I've got all my base foliage in, and I'm going to snip my string, turn it over, expose a little bit of the initial copper base, and tie that string in. Hello! What you're able to do at this stage is, because we've got enough binding on now, is look through your wreath and decide if there's any extra bits that you want to add anywhere. Like, I know I probably want some more variegation running through my wreath. Now we've got all this extra binding on, what you can do is just cut your foliage to the size that you want it, strip off a few leaves so you're exposing the stem, and then slot it in. So I'm just going to work through now, adding a few little bits of extra variegation and silver foliage just to lift this wreath. So there we have it. That is my foliage wreath. From a 12-inch moss base, it has evolved into this. I'm just going to add a few teasels now, and then we are done, and it's ready to hang on my door. Teasels have a really good strong stem, so you can just wedge them straight into your wreath. If you want to add any pine cones like this, then you need some florist stub wire like this. And all you do to wire them up to attach them is put that around and then wind around, and then get the two ends together and twist. And then you poke that through your moss and then loop it back round, back into the moss on the other side with your thumb. I'm not going to add any other decoration to this wreath because I like the foliage and the berries to be the star of the show. But you could always add some ribbons and some extra bits if you'd like at this point. I'm going to go home and hang this on my door. And if you'd like to join me next week, we're going to be using all the leftovers and offcuts from making this wreath to make a garland and table centre. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye!